Hi, this is Simon Obsdell and welcome to another tutorial for Apple Motion. And today I don't want to talk to you so much about a project as about a technique that you need to store in your arsenal because it's something that has an infinite variety of uses, and that's dust. A dust particle system will make every scene look better, both in terms of establishing the 3D depth and enhancing the lighting, as well as in selling the overall photorealism of your scene. So what I want to show you here is how to set up a default dust particle system that you can store in your favorites to be instantly accessible at any time. So let's take a look. So for this project, let's go with 1920 1080 25 frames a second, duration of 15 seconds. And the first thing I want to do is to make a particle. Now we could go into the library and look for the dust particles there. They're pretty nice. But if we make our own dust particle, then the project is completely transferable. If you need to share it with somebody else, they're not looking for an asset. And I think this makes a pretty nice dust particle anyway. So select the circle tool, draw out a small circle like that, always center it up, and come over here and geometry, and let's set that radius to be 4. And I'm just going to zoom in so you can see what I'm going to do next. So I'm going to come to filters and stylize and crystallize. I want to turn the speed all the way down, and then I want to duplicate that crystallize, right click duplicate, and I'm going to set the size to 4. And it just creates this sort of rough little particle like that. Actually, in the context of the overall thing, it actually works pretty well. So the next thing we want to do is to turn that into a particle system. Let's come to Object and Make Particles. And first of all, what I want to do is switch it to 3D. And I'm going to select a box for the shape. And I'm going to choose Random Fill for the arrangement. So to make this a universally useful particle system, I'm going to set the size to 4000 pixels. So it's going to be pretty nice and big for most purposes. So I'm just going to come along the timeline a little bit so you can see how it's all starting to shape up. So let's just set up this particle system. So I'm actually going to turn on Global 3D because that will allow the particles to react to the lights. In local 3D, they won't react with the lights. So let's just turn that on. You might decide that that's not something you want as a default, but I'm going to set it this way for this project. So then let's come down here. Let's have a birth rate of 100 and a birth rate randomness of 30. I'm exaggerating this so we can see very easily what we're doing here. You probably want a lower default birth rate, I think, probably something like, maybe 25 and 10 or something for those two figures. 5 is, I think, good for the life. And let's go for 10 for the speed. And I'm going to go for 40 for the speed randomness, which will allow them to drift around a bit. They're looking like that. So you can see they're kind of like popping on and off, and we don't want that. We want to come down here to the opacity over life. We want to open that up. Let's click here in the middle to make a new opacity tag. Let's click here at the end to make another one. So we've made 3 tags there. The first one we're going to set the opacity to 0. This one we're going to set it to 0. And maybe we'll adjust the position of this one to be about 40 or something. So that's just going to disguise the start and end of their life so we don't get that popping effect. So then let's address ourselves to the angle randomness. Let's have 360 for that. Let's also introduce some spin randomness, and let's go for 180 for that. And we might even want to come down and adjust the scale. So let's go for 75% for the scale and 25% for the scale randomness. Because we've got all this depth, it's probably less relevant to have random scale, but it's probably something that's quite nice to do. So anyway, now we've got that particle system set up. Pretty good, I think, as a starting point. What we do need to do is we need to turn this group to 3D in order to get the full effect of it. So then if we were to add a camera, and I'm just going to set up a little ramp on the Y rotation here. So add parameter behavior ramp. Let's set the start value to -30. And then if we press play, we can see that we're kind of drifting around this world of particles. We've got a real sense of depth because we've made that particle system 3D. So then we can call this group My Basic Dust. And we can come over to the library and we can come down to favorites And we can just drag that 3D group into the favorites like that. And then if we delete this, imagine we're now in a new project and we bring in My Basic Dust. There you go. It's all working very nicely. So this dust system will be there whenever you need it for your scene. You can just drag it in. I promise you the effort of setting it up is worthwhile because you only have to do it once and then you can tweak the emitter parameters to taste depending on what you're using it for. Now that is the end of this tutorial, but inevitably you're probably going to want me to explain how I set up my sample scene. So let's have a go at that. First thing I'm going to do is just bring in this text that I made. Just going to reset that position. So then that's my text. Nothing very fancy about that. I made it a little bit grey, as you can see. So the next thing I did was I brought in some clouds. So library and generators and clouds. Let's bring it in. Doesn't really matter whether it's behind or in front. I'm going to set the scale to 500%. And I'm going to set the blend mode to add. I also want to actually just add some lights before we go any further. So let's add a light. Let's set the intensity to 400% and the fall off to 10%. Let's give it some interesting color. Let's move it over negative 640 on X and let's move it out a little bit, 500 on Z. Let's duplicate that light. Let's change up the color a bit, so go the opposite way. Let's move it over positive 640 on X, a little bit closer. Let's make it 50 on Z, so it's much closer to our text like that. Now I'm going to come back and I'm going to do a bit more work on these clouds. So where the clouds were there, let's just set their position to be negative 100. Oh, and we've got a bit of rotation on there we don't need. Let's zero that out. Let's set the opacity down to 20%. Let's duplicate those clouds. Right click, duplicate. Let's set the opacity down to 10%. Let's set the position to negative 750. Let's maybe just come into the generator and just move the X position a bit like that so it's not the same as the other clouds layer. Let's duplicate it again. Right click, duplicate. Let's set this one to be 200 on Z. And let's set that opacity back up to, I don't know, 20% or something. And again, let's come in and just scroll maybe in the Y this time. So we've got a different kind of bit of clouds that we're working with there. So I think the other thing that I did was I added some lens flares. So let's come over and add object generators, lens flare. So what I did here was I came to the scale and I increased the X scale to 750, the Y scale to 200. Come back over to the generator, turn down the streak intensity and the ring radius. I set the intensity of this one up to 4 and I set the X position to be negative 50. Let's also drop this down behind the text like that. Actually, let's move it up a little bit on Y here with the Y center. Let's duplicate that, right click, duplicate. Let's move this over to, I don't know, 100 on X using that X center there. Let's maybe reduce this intensity down to about 1.5. Actually, I'd probably push that one back a little bit on Z. So let's go for that. Let's have negative 100 on Z. And this was my scene like this. And you can see again how those particles really help that feeling of depth and also the lighting as well, especially when we're getting these particles that are not lit because the lights are in fact behind those particles. Oh, and the only other thing I did was I set my height of my scene to 858 and you know we get this sort of much more exciting futuristic look. Probably want to actually just move this particle system back because it doesn't start at the beginning if you notice. And so if we grab that group and we drag it back like that, so we do have particles at the beginning, let's come to the end and let's come to mark and mark out, and then we get this. So overall, we're getting this sort of effect. And let's just park somewhere, looks interesting like that, and we disable our dust. You can see how dull that looks. That just looks like flat 2D graphics. Whereas as soon as we drop this in, we've got a real environment, real sense of depth, real sense of drama. So for the purposes of this tutorial, I've really exaggerated the whole dust effect, but as I've shown in many tutorials, even just a few dust particles, small and faint, can really help with selling the environment and the lighting and the overall photorealism of the scene. So I hope that's been interesting. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.